Mongolia. So I'll start with the introduction of Senator Mehreen Faruqi. And the topic today for the webinar she'll be talking about is the many facets of being a woman parliamentarian, because it's not easy. Hope, Rachna, you have put on recording. Thank you very much. So Dr. Mehreen Faruqi is the senator in Australian Parliament and representing the state New South Wales, the first Muslim woman elected in Australian Parliament. Senator Faruqi is a career engineer and lifelong activist for social and environmental justice. Since immigrating from Pakistan, like you heard that she was talking in Urdu with Saimagul. So she immigrated from Pakistan in 1992 and completing her doctorate at the University of New South Wales. Dr. Faruqi worked as an environmental engineer for local government, and as an academic, she directed the Institute of Environmental Studies at UNSW and was Associate Professor of Australian Graduate School of Management. She was elected in NSW Parliament's Upper House in 2013, where she was spokesperson on environment, transport, and women. She is the Australian Swing's spokesperson for education, industry, housing, and animal welfare. She will be speaking on the webinar on the issues relating to women in Parliament and the roles she has developed. So this is very exciting to listen to Senator Faruqi. So the mic is all yours. Thank you very much. And we are excited to hear more from you, your experience.
Thank you so much. Did you say the mic was on or off? I'm on? Yes. Excellent. Thanks so much, Nita, for that very beautiful introduction. And it is absolutely lovely to be here with all of you. And before I say anything more, I will acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I am on, Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and all my respect to the owners of the lands that you are on. I also want to acknowledge that First Nations people still face the worst of discrimination, of racism and disadvantage that exists in Australia, and especially in the wake of the brutal murder of George Floyd in the US. I want to remind us all of the injustices to Indigenous Australians that are ongoing after more than 2 centuries of invasion and colonization. And just some of these include the high and so disproportionate rates of incarceration, the horrific deaths in custody, and the recent completely disgraceful destruction of 46,000 years old sacred Aboriginal site in Western Australia. And that just happened last week when Rio Tinto decided to dig up minerals. And these are just a few to name. And it just shows to me how much work still needs to be done to dismantle centuries of structural racism and white supremacy. Because at the end of the day, I think for us Greens, there can be no social or environmental justice without racial justice. And I think we have to make sure that in all the work that we do across the world, that this is the foundation we build that work on. And I also want to send my solidarity to the Black Lives Matter activists and the protesters who are showing such courage at the moment. So on that rather somber note, I do hope that you're all staying well and safe during these very challenging times for all of us, the pandemic, plus all the other things that are going on in the world. But despite all of that, it's a real privilege to be with you all. And thank you so much for inviting me to share your meeting today. Meetings like this, I feel, provide a rather indulgent opportunity for me to reflect on my life, because you don't usually sit down and think about what you've done in life. When I was thinking about what to say here and responding to the topic of what it is like to be a woman in Parliament, I might also reflect a little bit about my journey into the Senate, And I can be very honest and very upfront to you and say that I never, ever had a burning desire, or perhaps even any desire, to be a politician. But I definitely had this real zest for defying cultural norms and, dominant societal views and patriarchy, especially views that treated people unequally based on their gender or on their social standing or on their religion. And for better or worse, throughout life, kind of that has been my mission. I've always rejected the limits that society tries to impose on us about what we should or shouldn't do, or what we should be or shouldn't be. And my mom, my Ammi, often reminds me now that when I was young, I was pretty annoying to her anyway, because I would relentlessly, nonstop question her about why girls were not allowed to do the same things as boys. And, I think that really drove her to the end of her tether until she gave in to what she now calls my stubbornness, but I call it determination. I grew up in Lahore in Pakistan, and these fights often that I had with my mom and dad were started quite young, and they were about me being allowed to do the same things as my two older brothers, who were allowed to stay out at night, or they were allowed to play cricket on the street or fly kites on the rooftop of my home. They studied engineering. So, and I didn't give up till I convinced my parents to allow me to play cricket and to fly kites. But those were quite hard fought battles. And then I think when it came to, I want to do civil engineering as well, that was much easier. And I feel that maybe by that time, both my parents were worn out and just said, well, let her do what she wants to do. So now as a senator in the Australian Parliament, those childhood battles and arguments in Pakistan are a distant memory, but my passion to change what I see as unfair has not changed one bit. And I feel now that the skills I acquired, on my mother do come in quite handy in the political arena when you've got to, fight those fights and convince people to do the right thing. When you have to challenge long-held views and archaic laws that need changing. And, these kind of campaigns that I have been front and center of and have been running, like decriminalizing abortion in New South Wales, or action on climate change, or, dismantling neoliberalism, or fighting against racism and for gender equality. When I came to Sydney from Lahore, that was a while ago now, in 1992, I came here with my husband, my 1-year-old son, and 2 suitcases, which is really, I think, the story of most migrants who move out of their countries that they may have grown up in to make other places home. And, I could not have, even at that point, could not have imagined in my wildest dreams that I would one day be a politician in Australia. And people are often surprised to hear that I never planned to be a politician, that, it kind of happened quite organically, or even perhaps accidentally. But for me, life has actually never been about having a very rigid plan. I think it's more exciting to, take up opportunities when they come, when there's a fork in the road, you take the road less traveled. And that's kind of what I've been doing. I've, taken up opportunities when they've come along, and I've fought a battle when it needed to be fought. And one of those forks in the road came very soon after I migrated here. And I just relate that incident because perhaps in Australia, that was my first foray into politics, at a very, not in parliamentary politics, but just into politics. And I landed in Australia on a Saturday in March 1992, and I started my master's on the Monday. But I soon realized that with a 1-year-old son, I would need childcare. And when I looked around in the area that I lived in, really, there was nothing that I could afford. And I think the situation is pretty much the same for women today as well. So I had a choice to either stop studying or to do something about it. So we decided to do something about it. And a few of our students at the University of New South Wales got together and lobbied the university to open up the university's first cooperative childcare center. And that's where both my children, I had a daughter later on, went while I was doing my master's and my PhD. And I also think that part of this kind of solutions-oriented approach comes from my engineering training as well. And I can tell you, I am definitely a political outsider here. In more ways than one. Obviously, you know, the equality between genders is not there. But for me, it was also growing up a world away. I didn't come through the so-called political ranks of student unions or, you know, party apparatchiks or political staffers. And I certainly didn't have the networks, you know, the boys' clubs connections that seemed to be prerequisite for a so-called political career. But then for me, politics was never a career path. You know, I've had, as Anita mentioned to you, I've had a wonderful career in civil and environmental engineering, which has spanned 2 decades, and it spanned two continents as well, so both Pakistan and here. And I worked as a consultant, as a structural engineer, as a water engineer, as a local government officer, in both in city areas and in regional areas in New South Wales. I've worked as a researcher, a teacher, and an academic, and I have loved every minute of it. If you know, people ask me what I wanted to be when I was growing up, it was always a teacher, and I think that will still be my first love. And I have tried to navigate my life and make choices based on, you know, where in an organization there are people who hold similar values to mine, or where in a workplace or in a community I can help collectively work with people to make change for the better. And, you know, rightly or wrongly, I don't know, these choices have never been made on what's the next rung in my career ladder or what's the next pay increase at all. But of course, I know that you don't always have these choices, and you don't always have the luxury of deciding, you know, what work or what job or what role you might want to take in life, because you have to put the food on the table. You have to pay the rent, and I've been there as well. And, you know, we all do what we have to do. But just coming back to politics, for me, it was always about public service. It was not about a career path. And I still feel that that might be an old-fashioned view, but I think some traditional ideas are worth holding on to. And it's the same values and same guiding principles of fairness and equality for everyone that actually drew me to the Greens. And one of the reasons I joined the Greens was because, you know, our party is always challenging society to be better. We have the courage and the honesty to often bring matters to the political and public agenda that no one else will. You know, like fighting for safety for asylum seekers, who are people just like us, or for equality with and for people who are often disadvantaged and marginalized in society, like First Nations, like LGBTQI, like migrants, like people of color, like people with disability. You know, we went against the tide years ago when we started calling for Australia to stop mining and burning coal and move to 100% renewable energy. And something very close to my heart, you know, fighting for animal rights and animal welfare. So all these values really fit in well with lessons that I had learned from one of my favorite feminist aunts, who taught me to stand up for myself, to never be afraid to speak up, to speak the truth, no matter the circumstances, because it is the right thing to do. And just recently, while I was in America, where my young daughter is studying, I actually had a tattoo done, if you can say that, which is bold, and in English that means speak out. So it's just a reminder of my aunt, who always taught me to do that. And, you know, I try to the best of my ability to do that every single day. And so I took all of my lived experience, my professionalism, and quite an open mind when I first stepped into Parliament. But I think most of all, I took with me in the spirit of challenging power and questioning the status quo. And that's what I do every single day. And I think when you asked me to speak today, you also asked me to kind of relate some of the day-to-day life of what happens in Parliament. So I thought I'd give you a little bit of a snapshot. But the first thing is that there is no one typical day that you have in this life as a politician. And that's both challenging, but also quite exciting. But there are 2 distinct phases when you are a parliamentarian. One is when you actually are in Canberra, when Parliament is sitting, and then quite a different phase when I'm back in Sydney in my electorate office. So Parliament sits for about half a year. And, you know, those weeks, myself and two of my staff, and Maliha is one of them who's here as well today with us. We kind of pack our bags, then head there on a Sunday. And Canberra is about four hours away from Sydney. And we often, you know, we often fly. It's 4 hours drive, but we often fly because, you know, it's much faster and easier. So we go there on a Sunday and we come back on the Thursday night. And things that we do there are, you know, legislation. There's a lot of committee work, a lot of inquiries going on different issues. Obviously, we put in motions in Parliament to try and convince others to do good things. We obviously have meetings with stakeholders in my different portfolios of housing, of education, of industry, animal welfare, and foreign aid. There's quite a bit of media attention as well when you are in Parliament. So we do quite a bit of media. There could be radio interviews or television interviews, or even talking to newspaper journalists. We have at the moment 9 Greens in the Senate and 1 in the lower house. And when, you know, they say that Canberra, often it's said in Australia that the Canberra bubble, you know, it really is a bit of a bubble for many reasons. But one of the reasons is that once you get into Parliament on the Monday morning, you know, you're pretty much there till very late every night, and we can't really leave Parliament House because we kind of sit from, let's say, 9:30 to 10 one night, or 10 to 8:30 the other night. And there's always votes happening and legislation going on. So we're stuck there. But the other, I guess, some of the quite unexpected and quite lovely things that happen in Parliament as well, that although, you know, we don't have the numbers in terms of votes to get many of the things that we want to happen in society, there are some very surprising moments where, you know, bills that we put forward get through, or that something horrible that this Conservative government has put forward, we kind of can oppose that. And a couple of quick examples I'll give you, which are quite recent of the last couple of years, the last couple of months as well, is a bill the Conservative government at the moment put up, which they call Ensuring Integrity Bill, but it was really a big attack on unions. And initially we didn't have the numbers, but while we were debating the bill in the Senate and I had carriage of that bill, we were negotiating with other crossbenchers and the opposition party. And while that was going on, just on the floor, we suddenly got the numbers, and we overturned that bill. And the government at that time promised that they would bring it back on. But because of a huge community campaign in opposition to that, they have now decided that they're not going to do it. So, you know, it's never a done deal. The other quick one that I'll mention is the bill that we had put forward in the Senate, which was to ban live sheep export from Australia to other countries. And the reason for doing that is that thousands of sheep have died, horrific deaths, on these, what I call ships of misery, on which they're put on for weeks in really hot and humid conditions. And the images we have seen and the stories that we have heard from people on the ships, how the ships are kind of, you know, die from the heat, is just horrible. So we got that bill passed in the Senate as well. But the House of Reps is a different story, the House of Representatives, and the government has complete control of it, really. So we couldn't really get it through there. A quick few other things is there's a program that and so for a day, young women come into Parliament and they take over our offices, and that's really a lovely, beautiful, privileged thing to do. And, you know, last year there was also a sit-in in Parliament where activists came in and they sat in Parliament House, you know, kind of campaigning for the government to tackle climate change. So it is a very exciting life. It's a very full-on life. But when I started in Canberra 2 years ago, obviously, I didn't know the full ins and outs of living out of a suitcase. And I think Malia said it would be really nice today to mention some of the very practical things that we faced when we started there, you know, because you forget things at home and, you know, there's hardly an opportunity to go and buy things. I've had a couple of wardrobe malfunctions. So now we've actually bought a sewing kit and put it in our office. The other one, challenge that my office generally faces, is the food. The food in Parliament House is terrible. And you might think, oh, what a trivial thing Mehreen is saying, but really you have to spend all week there, week after week. You need to eat, and you need to eat proper food. So my staff and I actually we cook our food and take our food there for the whole week. So those are just some, tidbits of life in Canberra. But back in Sydney, most of the focus is working with the community, campaigning, pushing our campaigns for free university, housing for everyone because it is a human right, for free childcare, tackling the climate crisis. And that's where I feel that for me, my work really is. Of course, Canberra is very important, but I think that change often comes from the community, and we have to build our movement much bigger and engage with much more people to ensure that that's the way we can change society to be more equal and more just. And of course, during COVID-19, life has changed for every single person on the planet. And for me and my office now, we're working from home most of the time. And that time that I used to spend face-to-face in the community is now all doing Zoom meetings. And I think in some ways it's become much harder. In some ways it's much better because many more people can access conversations through technology. But there are also kind of no limits, and your expectations of your availability are much higher. So all this week I've started at 7 in the morning and finished at 9 or 9:30 at night, because we've had forum after forum, which is obviously fantastic. But as my husband tells me often, that I don't have any limits, and that's the way it is. You've got to be yourself. I am often asked about my journey from engineer to politician. And I think people often ask that because you don't see many people like me in Parliament, a migrant, a Muslim woman of color, and an engineer. We're kind of a very small minority. And in Australia, to be frank, our parliaments do not at all represent the really rich diversity of people that live here. And when I say diversity, I mean gender diversity, I mean ethnic and cultural diversity, and I mean diversity of professional backgrounds. I mean, parliaments are still, as they say, pretty male and pretty white. When I started in the upper house in New South Wales, there were only 10 women out of 42 members. I mean, I think that's pretty terrible for a country like Australia. And last year was the first time in history that the Senate actually reached equal representation. But the story is still quite different in the House of Reps. And I was only the 100th woman to actually go into the Senate. The media dug this up, and I was quite shocked to hear that. Like, in history of the Senate of Australia, there's only been 100 women in there. We know that, research tells us that in Australia, there's a real lack of cultural diversity at top of Australian companies and in parliaments, and it's still mainly kind of European background that make up most of those leadership positions. And the lack of diversity in all these aspects is not just unrepresentative of our contemporary society, but it also means that decisions and decision making is often very shackled by the narrowness of the views that people might hold. And that really, I think, hampers creativity and innovation, because that only comes when different points of view and perspectives are debated and a variety of lived experiences are listened to and heard. Otherwise, we do end up with policies that are, pretty lacking in depth or in complexity. And they're often then developed within those narrow mandates of a few political parties and a few people that are representing those political parties. If COVID-19 has taught us anything, it's that we really need to reimagine everything. That we cannot allow neoliberalism and rampant capitalism to continue to destroy our planet and our people. That everything needs to change. But to change everything, we actually have to address the root causes. And we have to dismantle the systems of profit and wealth accumulation, which work for a tiny few at the expense of everyone else. And that is really the only way to deal with the twin crisis of climate collapse and rising inequality as well. But this has to be done through really authentic, shared, and sophisticated leadership, which I feel is the exact opposite of the adversarial approach that I see in politics. You know, you often see these really macho displays of point scoring, and there's continuous yelling and talking over each other. And it really just engenders this aggressive culture. And then everyone is kind of expected to, act like a man in order to succeed. For me, that's deeply off-putting and something that I have rejected pretty outrightly, really. So if my journey across countries, across cultures, and across workplaces has taught me anything, it's that the way forward is to boldly challenge and change dominant mindsets and authority. That we must feel the fear and do it anyway. But of course, doing this is risky and it's dangerous. And politics has not been easy for me. At times, I've really had to draw on every last bit of strength instilled in me by my elders, especially in the face of sustained racist, sexist, and toxic abuse that people like me and my family are subjected to day in and day out. And it's not really because of what I do, because I can do anything or nothing, and that, violence is still thrown at me. It's really because of who I am, what I look like, and where I come from. And I've often thought about, especially lately, when, the more you are in public life, the more that hate flows your way, or the way of some of us. And I have wondered lately, whether, is it all worth it? I've given it a lot of thought. And for me, I still have fire in my belly, and I think it is a burden worth carrying. And it has been made much lighter by the opportunity to work with thousands of extraordinary, kind, compassionate people who, like all of us, are determined to create a brighter and better future for all of us. So I think I might finish there. I'm a politician, I can talk forever, and I used to be a lecturer as well. So I used to giving 3-hour lectures, but let's open up the conversation and have a chat about what your experiences have been, and if there's anything else that you'd like to ask me.
Thanks, Mehreen, for the wonderful conversation. And you have shown us the various facets of your life. And I have already learned a lot from your experience. So we'll open the floor for all the participants, but I will request everybody to raise their hands so that Rachna can help us unmuting them. So there's a question from Saima Gul. Saima, you please go ahead.
Hi, Mehreen. I have a question that, the base scenario of Pakistan, that here is still we are facing discrimination. So as you have briefly defined your life story, so how can we can create change in our society, or how can we work for to eliminate the discrimination against women?
So Saima, and I've kind of come to this conclusion after living in Pakistan and after living here, that this fight against patriarchy or inequality is a pretty universal fight. When I was growing up in Pakistan, obviously very conscious of the inequality that existed between, men and women in Pakistan. And I kind of had this vision, and I'm talking about, I was born in the 60s, 70s. You had this vision that countries like Australia, the so-called developed countries, had actually reached equality in every facet of law and society. So I must say, when I came here, I was pretty shocked how much discrimination and inequality existed and still exists in the last 30 years that I have been here. For example, there's a huge pay gap, for instance, between genders. We have found out through through the COVID crisis, it is women who are on the front line of majority of the impact. Many reasons, like women have lost so many more jobs because the sectors that they work in were heavily casualized. They are also on the front line in terms of the health kind of effects as well, because they are nurses, they are teachers. So, I think this is, although the levels might be different, this is a very universal fight, and it has to be fought that way. when, I visited Pakistan I do every year, but a few years ago, and I had the chance of meeting with quite a few women politicians. And I found out that they had actually formed a women's caucus across party lines. And that's something we haven't been able to achieve in Australia. And I asked those women, like, how did you come out of party lines? And they said, they looked at me as if I was really stupid. And they said, well, why wouldn't we? Like, fighting for women's rights is more important than anything. So, I feel that there's a lot to be learned from each other. It's not places like, Australia, where things might be somewhat better, that have lessons for places like Pakistan. But it's kind of both ways. But the one thing I would say is that you just don't give up. This is a fight over the long term. You don't give up. And I take courage from the past history of how civil rights movements and environmental movements, for instance, have often been led by women. Some of them have been recognized and others haven't been. But I was just reading a few years ago the story of the Chipko women in India, who in the 1970s stopped kind of mass deforestation by making circles around trees when they came down to chop trees. So they were pretty much putting their lives on the line. We know in Pakistan, there are so many human rights activists, women especially, who have given up their lives for this. And we, I think, need to take courage from them and hold up their legacy. And I think we just can't give up. And we have to join hands and make allies. There's no other way to do it.
Thank you so much for sharing your ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Mehreen. You explained very well. So now we have Rebecca with us. She has a question. Rachna, can you help her unmuting the microphone?
It's all right. I think I got it. Hey, Mehreen, how's it going? Lovely to see you, as always.
Likewise, so lovely to see you.
I just wanted to ask, and I think it might be helpful for anyone that is thinking of possibly running for the Greens in any of the countries. We need as many women as possible to do it. What are some of the ways that you have managed to cope with, you mentioned the hatred and the vile that you have to deal with on a daily basis, and even more so when you're in the limelight. What are some of the practical ways that you cope with that, and how have you built your resilience?
It's not easy, Rebecca, I can tell you. I mean, there have been days when I just haven't wanted to get out of bed. So, I'll say up front that, when you face these challenges, they're not easy. They're not easy challenges. But I have dealt with them because I have people around me in my office, in my team, people around me in my family, people around me in the Greens movement. Although I have to say that sometimes in the Greens movement as well, there are still people that you have to challenge on many views, but there are also others who really support you and help you as well. And really, at the end of the day, it is all about having that support. It really is. I mean, for many years since I came, and I spoke about the racism and the hate that comes now that I'm in public life, but that has always existed. Even when I came here, it was at a different level. And I decided, well, I just want to ignore that. I was always finding excuses for why people were doing this, and I thought, oh no, maybe I'm being too sensitive, or or people don't understand, so we have to educate people, and maybe that is part and parcel of it. But I reached a time where I thought, I just can't not ignore it anymore. And so part of dealing with it is also exposing it, and kind of letting people know that this happens, and this is a daily experience for so many in Australia, for Indigenous people, especially for Muslim women in the last some years. So I think exposing that, but doing that in a way which is very different to how the hate comes your way. So, doing it with kind of love is how I think I've decided to do it. They often say kill people with love, and I think that's our motto in our office as well. Just be nice as much as you can, but do it pretty truthfully and pretty blatantly. So I don't miss an opportunity now in Parliament to talk about issues, not just issues personal, like that come personally to me, but that happen to other people as well. And, you know, I realized through that actually a lot of people didn't know that that was happening. And when they do know, you do form more allies. And, you know, we just need our movement to grow bigger and bigger, that there's no other way. You've got to have those conversations and convince people and change their hearts and minds. And it takes time, but I really don't think there is any other way.
Thanks. Awesome. So kill people with love. So that's a good, you know, terminology, and we all can learn this because women keep facing all these problems. So that's wonderful teaching. Anybody has any comment or question for Mehreen? I don't see any hands raising. Mehreen, would you like to say something else which reminds you that you should share it with others?
I'm just thinking, what else do we share?
I have a suggestion.
Yep.
Nikki just raised her hand too. Mehreen, you were at the forefront of the campaign to legalise abortion in our state in New South Wales. Maybe it's a really nice case study to look at, and just what was involved in campaigning on that issue and what it took to get through could be very useful for us all.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can say that's one of the biggest campaigns that we have run from my office, and one of the most difficult things I think I have done in politics is that campaign, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But that was, you know, when I was talking to Saima about her question, that was one of the things that I was shocked at when I came to Australia. I couldn't really believe that in New South Wales, in this century, abortion was still in the Crimes Act. You know, it was, for some women, it was easy to access, but for many it wasn't, because it was costly. There are very few places who actually provided pregnancy termination service. And in regional New South Wales, people had to, you know, women had to travel hundreds of kilometers to access that. So for me, it was always an issue of gender equality. Fighting that fight was about the basic right of women to make decisions about their own bodies. Of course, it was an issue of health as well, and why a matter of health was, you know, criminalized. So when in the first few weeks after starting in New South Wales Parliament, there was a bill by one of a very conservative MPs that was about further decriminalizing abortion. That was actually about giving fetuses a separate legal identity to their mother. And that's where we built this huge movement to oppose that bill. And we did. We were very successful in kind of not having that bill passed. But during that movement, every one of us realized that we can't keep waiting for bills like this, these attacks on women's rights coming at us, you know, every other year. We have to be really proactive and build momentum to decriminalize abortion in New South Wales. So when I started, I reached out to progressive politicians in other parties and was pretty much kind of hit on the head and said, no, we can't do this, and don't you dare do it as well. Because we got some rights 40 years ago, and you will jeopardize those rights and we will go backwards. And for me, that wasn't really a good enough response from them, because the more I looked into it, the more I saw that their political parties did not have the policy to do this. And so in some ways, they didn't want anyone else to do this as well. And the more I spoke to people out in the community, outside of Parliament, the more people said, this is ridiculous. Like, we can't move forward with this. So that's how the campaign started. It was a 5-year campaign. I it was based around the bill that we had drafted, and that we then debated after building a huge movement around it. But that bill, my bill, which was the first ever bill, which was also very shocking in the history of New South Wales Parliament to attempt to decriminalize abortion. And of course, the very conservative Catholic lobby came out and started, spreading myths around why it shouldn't be decriminalized, how women would start having abortions at just a day before birth. For instance, like all of it was rubbish. And of course, the direct attacks on me as a baby killer. And I think that's when it became really, really difficult, that you weren't even getting support from the more progressive so-called pro-choice politicians in Parliament, and you were being attacked continuously from a very strong, kind of well-funded lobby as well. So yeah, it was difficult. We had sleepless nights, and Maliha, who was very involved with me from my office in that campaign can vouch for that. So that bill did not pass Parliament. That was in 2016. But and that was thoroughly disappointing. They were, our gallery in the chamber was full, and women were so angry. We got so many calls that day from women saying how, like, they could not believe it, because they were all expecting that bill to pass. They couldn't believe the arguments that were given against, arguments given for voting against the bill. But what that did was that made our movement even stronger. And that became a big issue at the next election and after the next election. And really, in 2 years, the government had no choice but to decriminalize abortion. So, we Greens often don't get the credit for things we do, because it wasn't the Greens bill that passed, it was someone else's bill that passed. But at the end of the day, we got that change made. And I think the most difficult thing was to bring that issue, which had remained dormant, to kind of break that silence on that issue. A 30-year silence was kind of the biggest challenge we had. And once that was done through community campaigning, and I traveled the length and breadth of New South Wales, holding events, doing street talks, talking to women's health centers, all of that, and we had everyone supporting us. Once that happened, then for me it was inevitable. If my bill didn't pass, I knew that soon something would happen, and it has happened, and we're there. So, I think looking back, probably all the angst and the difficulty and the hardship was worth it, because we have changed the life of so many people in New South Wales.
Awesome. Kudos, Mehreen, for your work. Now we have question from Yuko. Yuko, are you there? Do you want to say your question, or you want me to speak out? Okay, so her question is that, is immigrants female congressmen besides the Green Party in Australia?
I'm just thinking immigrants. I'm sure there are immigrants, but I'm not sure about first generation migrants. I mean, I know there are a couple who came here as children. One in the Labour Party who is also a Muslim woman of color. But I can't really think of anyone else who may not be of Anglo-Saxon background. Maliha, could you help me out here?
Can't think of anyone in the federal parliament. There may be a couple in state parliaments, I think, across Australia.
But still very few. And the few that are there usually came here when they were children with their parents. And, I can kind of understand some reasons for that. I mean, it took me about 12 years after migrating to Australia to even think about, doing and getting involved in community. It does take that time. When I came here in 1992, it was what Paul Keating, our prime minister at that time, called the recession we had to have. And, even after we were told in Pakistan, my husband and I, both engineers, that there were plenty of engineering jobs in Australia, there was absolutely nothing. And whatever there was, people didn't want to hire us because we didn't have local experience. So, you know, it took a while to get ourselves settled, to find a home, to get, you know, kids settled, to finish my study. I think that's a huge barrier. So what our government can do is to actually remove those barriers and help migrants settle in much quicker, provide much better services. And I know that services for migrants since then have deteriorated even further. You know, the two big major parties in our country are very quick to court migrant communities, and, you know, for voting blocks, but they don't kind of provide them a pathway to enter politics. I've seen that so many times, and I've actually been riling up the women of color in those parties to say, you know, just don't stay quiet, you know, fight for it in your parties. And so, yeah, it's not an easy, even in our own party. Hey, I'm the first woman of color or person of color in our party room. And if we look across, you know, in party here, there's little diversity, to be frank. So we have our own work cut out for us in that aspect.
Wonderful.
And I know that
So we have
Rebecca here is very passionate about that as well. And we are kind of partners in crime in getting that changed.
Good to hear that. So we have a question from Naila Ahmed. She's saying that she's Pakistani Australian, and there are a number of parallels I draw between us. May I ask, what was the first thing you did when you joined the Greens? I recently joined as a new member and would love some suggestions.
Oh, fantastic, Naila. Welcome. It'd be really lovely to have a chat to you. So send me an email and maybe we catch up for coffee. I'm not sure if you're in Sydney or not, or we can catch up on Zoom now. Everyone is so proficient in doing that. So would love to meet you face to face. So I joined the Greens not in Sydney, where, you know, the majority of the members, I guess, in New South Wales are, but I used to live up in Port Macquarie, which is about 4.5 hours north of Sydney, halfway between Brisbane and Sydney. Small country town. And I think my husband and I made that decision, a very deliberate decision, to move out of Sydney 10 years after we had been here, just because life was kind of just working hard and not having any time with our two young children. And we said, no, there has to be something more to life. And we also wanted to experience more of Australia. So, and that's really where I, you know, got the time to get connected with the community. Because small towns, it is just, life is so different and so much easier. We're both working in the local council there. We made many connections. That's where I started kind of helping out with the refugee support groups, with bush care groups, with land care groups. You know, and one night as I was sitting around our table, we'd invited a few friends to dinner, and we were sitting around table and talking politics. And there were about 8 people in my house. And, you know, they all turned out to be Greens members in that Greens group. I think all of the Greens members were sitting around my table. And I just thought, okay, I think it's time that I put my hat in the ring as well and join the Greens. And really at that time, like I said, I had really no intention of being a politician. So for me, it was really about joining a movement which was so aligned with what I wanted to do in life, you know, to address the climate crisis, but even more so joining a political movement that actually understood about discrimination against minority groups, that understood the atrocities that were happening in Palestine. So, you know, that had empathy for refugees, that was willing to put their hand up and actually say it when no one else would. And what I did in the Greens at that time was actually help out at elections with our other candidates, helping out, you know, hand out for them. And it was just, I think country life for me in Australia has been just so beautiful. I had 2 children and, you know, we would have meetings in the park where the kids could run around and we could still meet. And then a few years later, I came back to Sydney, and again, there was a bit of a shock return when my local group here held meetings in a pub. So it was a bit different. But yeah, so back in Sydney, I then once, you know, decided to put my hand up as a candidate, and then I guess the rest is history. So I think anything that you can do, there isn't an expectation that, you know, you have to do this or the other. But I did find that helping out at election times was particularly inspiring, because that's when a lot of people actually are engaged, and you can have discussions with people about politics, about what they want Australia to be. And, you know, door knocking was one of the things. That might sound a bit weird as well, but I love door knocking. I love door knocking. And so if you like talking to people, like I think most Pakistanis do, then that's the thing for you, Naila.
So wonderful, Mehreen. We have 3 more questions or comments. So Apeksha, here you go with the question. Dr. Apeksha.
Yes, thank you, Anita ji. Thanks a lot, Mehreen, for such a wonderful insight. Actually, I wanted to ask that what are the specific skills or characteristics required to become a successful woman politician? I mean, what are those skills for in light of your experiences you had?
I think skills you can learn. I don't think you need any specific skills. I think you've just got to have passion and empathy.
Okay,
I think.
nice.
Yeah, I mean, any skills, you know, you can learn to be a politician, but you have to have a bit of a fire in your belly. Like
Okay.
you have to really feel that you know, yeah, have feeling and passion to, you know, for whatever issues you feel important. I think we all have the capacity, you know, if we want to be in Parliament, and that's what we need. We need people with a variety of different backgrounds and different skills to be there. So really, any skill can work, but I think it's really it's your empathy and passion that is needed.
Thank
I
you.
know. What do you think? What do you feel? I feel that often, you know, us women, and research tells us that we often assess ourselves on what we have and what we don't have. And I know that I've done that for many years. You know, whenever I used to look at a job application, I would immediately go to, out of the 10 selection criteria, oh my God, I don't meet 3, so I can't apply for this job. And my husband's been great in that, and he's saying, well, you meet 7. Like, who else will meet those criteria? But we are very self-critical of ourselves, I think, Dr. Apeksha. And yeah, I just think, you know, I've kind of try now not to do that. You know, if there's a challenge there, you know, I try to say, no, I can deal with this.
Yes,
And
I do connect
and
with
do
you.
whatever is needed.
Empathy
Yeah.
is yep. Yes.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Mehreen. And we are very close to 1 hour. And right now we have Umaira from Bangladesh. Umaira, please go ahead with your question or comment.
Thank you. Actually, I have a question about the environmental governance, what the Australian Green Party is doing to establish environmental governance.
Environmental governance as in Australia, in like, are you talking more globally or?
Only in Australia.
Well, as you know, we have 4 pillars for the Greens in Australia, and obviously environmental sustainability is a huge one of those. I mean, I've lived my life for the past 30 years in Australia, really fighting for the environment, both in my profession as well as in the party. So, and we've realized more and more now that, you know, unless we have a healthy environment, we can't have a healthy society or a healthy economy. So I think that's how we try and push the debate. Like with the climate crisis, you may have kind of seen on television and read about the bushfires this summer in Australia, and how they have impacted, you know, the economy, people's lives, and how things have been destroyed. So our push is always to keep environment central to kind of, you know, what we do. But like I said earlier, it's, you know, for us as well, it's about racial justice too, especially for our First Nations people, and to kind of to make that central to any fight we have, whether it's the environmental fight, because, you know, for centuries, First Nations people had been living in Australia with the environment, as a part of the environment and protecting it. And ever since colonization, we've seen the how species have become extinct, how the destruction of the environment has taken place. So it is about making it an issue, but it's also important how we frame that particular issue as well. So our big campaigns at the moment, particularly for climate and environment, are about Australia kind of moving towards 100% renewable energy. You know, Australia is the biggest exporter of coal, so we not only burn coal here, but we actually export it in other countries to be burnt as well, which is obviously exacerbating global climate change. So our big campaign at the moment is to kind of stop coal mining, stop coal fired power stations, but also to make sure that the people who are working in those industries have a just transition, so that governments invest in helping those communities move to other jobs and other industries.
Thanks, Mehreen. So before ending the webinar, I'll just be taking 2 questions. Mahima, do you have any questions? Mahima is from India Greens Party. Okay, so I can't hear Mahima. So we have again question or comment from Rebecca. So yeah.
Sorry, I'll be quick. Mehreen, just one more question. If we, I'd like to see in our lifetime that we actually get a truly representative parliament in Australia, but I'd like to know from your perspective what you think that might look like, or what the tell might be that we've actually reached that. And I mean, you know, diversity in terms of cultural representation, gender, et cetera, et cetera.
So I think when our parliaments looks like the streets and suburbs of the places we live in, I think that's when we've reached true representation. We're far away from it, Rebecca, but you know, we can do it in our lifetime.
Wonderful. So I would like to thank you for this wonderful session and for the wonderful insights of your experience being a senator, and your I'm very much impressed by you, and I have already met you, so I've been motivated, and I keep working for Greens. So thank you very much. And Michelle and Rachna, do you want to thank Mehreen for this session?
Sure. Anita, Rishana, I, and also Sarul from Mongolian Greens organize these sessions. So for me, just thank you heaps, Mehreen. Keep going strong. Great work you've done, and really appreciate everything you do.
Yes, thank you very much, Mehreen, for your wonderful session. The word you said, you should have a fire in your belly and a passion and a kindness. That what drops you for the greatness. And yeah, that is what I felt it on my heart also. And yeah, thank you very much for this session. Thank you.
Not at all. It has been absolute pleasure. And you know, you all have fired me up again. It's been wonderful.
So thank you, everybody, those who have attended and participated in this webinar.
Anita, I want to say hello from Sweden, and thank you.
Hi, Eva.
Yeah.
Hi, Eva.
And I think the internal environment is also very important for an external environment we can live in. Because if you don't feel very well in your soul, you can't handle the big problems we have.
Very true, yes.
Mehreen, Eva is a long-term Global Greens figure, and she was a former member of parliament from Sweden as well. So
Oh,
thank
wow.
you for joining us, Eva.
Yeah, wonderful. Come and visit us sometime, Eva.
Yes, Eva, come over here.
I would like to.
And she is Global Greens fundraiser also. So yeah, great woman.
Yeah, wonderful. I mean, you're all amazing women, really. I mean, some of the challenges in the places that you are in are I think, much harder than here in Australia. So you are incredible. Never forget that.
Yeah. So we have unmuted it. Everybody can say bye from their country. So we have a recording that we have women from different countries. You can, everybody